Okay, so who else here is guilty of grocery shopping on an empty stomach? Like, you walk in for a couple of things, and suddenly you've got a whole cart full of stuff you didn't even know you needed.
Oh, tell me about it. The snack aisle is my ultimate downfall when I'm hungry.
Right? It's like our willpower just evaporates, and we're easy prey for those strategically placed impulse buys. And, thinking about it, that whole shopping while hungry thing, it's not just about groceries, is it? It's a metaphor for how we make decisions in all areas of life, especially in business.
Totally. And when it comes to business decisions, those impulse buys aren't bags of chips and candy bars. They're wasted resources, missed deadlines, projects that go way off track.
Exactly. That's where Paul Colligan's book, Never Go Shopping When You're Hungry, comes in. It's all about making more strategic decisions in business and avoiding those impulse buy moments that can really cost us.
The book is full of great stuff, but one of the key takeaways is this idea of overactive possibility syndrome, or OPS, as Colligan calls it.
OPS. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more about that.
So OPS is that feeling of being overwhelmed by all the options, of constantly chasing the next shiny object, instead of focusing on what truly moves the needle for our goals. That business plan we spent weeks crafting, suddenly it's out the window because someone mentioned a new marketing tactic on a podcast.
Oh, I've been there. It's like the business world is designed to give us OPS. There's always a new platform to be on, a new strategy to try, a new tool that promises to revolutionize our workflow. It's enough to make anyone's head spin.
It is, and before we know it, we're spread thin, overwhelmed, and no closer to achieving our actual goals. But Colligan, he doesn't just point out the problem, he gives us a framework for overcoming it.
Okay, so what's the secret sauce? How do we overcome this OPS and become more strategic shoppers in the business world?
Well, Colligan breaks it down into 4 key questions. And the first one, it seems deceptively simple, but it's where a lot of us trip up. He asks, what do you want your project to do?
That does seem pretty straightforward. What do I want my project to do? What could be more obvious than that?
Right. But think about it. How often do we get caught up in the excitement of the project itself, the how of it all, without clearly defining what success actually looks like? We're so busy shopping for solutions that we forget to define the problem we're trying to solve.
Okay, I see what you mean. It's like you're so focused on getting that fancy new hammer that you forget to ask yourself, wait, am I even trying to build something that requires a hammer?
Exactly. Colligan actually uses that example in the book. He says it's like focusing on getting a hammer without ever asking yourself if you're actually trying to hang a picture.
Okay, that's a great analogy. So before we even start thinking about the tools or tactics, we need to define that desired outcome. We need to know what picture we're trying to hang on the wall, so to speak.
Precisely. And Colligan illustrates this with a great example in the book. He talks about 2 people, Bob and Linda, who are both launching podcasts.
Okay, I'm listening. I'm all about a good podcasting story.
So, Bob, full of enthusiasm, decides he wants his podcast to inspire 1 million people, which is an awesome aspiration. But how do you even begin to measure that? How do you know if your podcast is actually inspiring anyone, let alone 1 million people?
Yeah, that's pretty tough to quantify. Downloads maybe,
Yep.
But even then.
Right. Linda, on the other hand, had a very different approach. She knew she wanted to launch a podcast, but she first asked herself that crucial question: what do I want this podcast to do for my business?
So for Linda, the podcast wasn't the end goal. It was a tool to achieve a specific outcome.
Exactly.
Okay, I'm hooked. What was Linda's picture on the wall? What was she hoping to achieve with her podcast?
Her goal was crystal clear. She wanted to use her podcast to generate leads and ultimately boost sales for her consulting business.
Ah, so very specific and measurable. She knew exactly what she wanted her podcast to do.
Exactly. And that clarity of purpose is what sets her up for success right from the get-go. It's the foundation for everything that comes next.
Okay, I'm starting to see why that first question is so crucial, even if it seems obvious on the surface.
It's all about being intentional and defining that desired outcome before we even start thinking about solutions.
So we've got our picture on the wall, so to speak. Now what?
That brings us to Colligan's second question, which is, how will you know the project is doing it?
All right, so we've defined what that desired outcome. Now we need to figure out the how. How will we measure success? How will we know if our project is actually doing what we set out for it to do?
That's exactly it. And this is where a lot of people, they fall into the trap of what I call vanity metrics. They're those numbers that look good on paper or maybe in our monthly report, but don't actually translate to meaningful results.
Oh, I know exactly what you mean. It's like you're excited about all those likes and followers, but your actual sales haven't budged an inch.
Right. Or, going back to the grocery shopping analogy, it's like being excited about all those bonus points you racked up, but you've gone way over budget and can't even afford the gas to drive home. Those points aren't doing you any good if you can't actually pay for your groceries.
Okay, that's a painful but accurate comparison.
Yeah.
So how do we choose the right metrics, the ones that actually matter for our goals?
Well, let's revisit Linda and Bob. Remember, Linda's goal was to generate leads and boost sales for her consulting business. So she knew she needed to track metrics that were directly tied to those outcomes.
So instead of just looking at downloads or vanity metrics, she was looking at, the number of people who contacted her for consultations after listening to a particular episode.
Exactly. She was tracking phone calls, emails, actual conversions that she could directly attribute to her podcast.
And what about Bob? What metrics was he tracking with his more, actually say, aspirational goal of inspiring 1 million people?
Well, Bob was focused on downloads, likes, shares, those feel-good numbers that are easy to get excited about but don't necessarily translate into real-world impact.
It's like you can have 1 million people download your podcast, but if they're all tuning out after the first minute, are you really inspiring anyone?
Exactly. And that's the danger of vanity metrics. They can give us a false sense of success.
They're like those false positives you hear about with medical tests. You get a positive result, but it turns out it wasn't actually accurate. It's like, oh, never mind, you're not actually cured.
And unfortunately, in the business world, those false positive metrics can lead to some pretty costly mistakes.
It's like celebrating a victory lap before you've actually crossed the finish line. So we've defined our picture on the wall, and we're tracking the right metrics. What's next on our strategic decision-making journey?
That's where things get really interesting. Because now it's time to ask ourselves Colligan's third and perhaps most crucial question, and that is the project actually doing it?
Oof, that's the question, isn't it? It's one thing to set goals and track metrics, but actually facing the truth about whether a project is working, that takes guts.
It really does. And sometimes a good dose of humility, too. We all want to be right to have our projects be successful, but sometimes the most strategic move is admitting when something isn't working.
Easier said than done, though, right? Especially when we've poured our heart and soul, not to mention time and resources into something. It's tough to let go.
Absolutely. Colligan actually tells a great story about this in the book, about being at a fancy restaurant, ordering an expensive bottle of wine.
That was one of my favorite parts of the book. Okay, so fancy restaurant, expensive wine.
Yeah, and he takes that first sip and he's corked, totally ruined.
Ugh, the worst. Have you ever had to send back a corked bottle? I always feel so awkward doing it. Like, I don't know, am I supposed to be able to tell it's corked just by smelling it? What if I'm wrong?
Right, it's the worst. But here's the thing. Colligan, he says he sends it back every single time, without hesitation, because he knows he's paying for a certain experience and he's not settling for less, even if it means having a slightly uncomfortable conversation with the sommelier.
Okay, I love that. So what you're saying is, we need to be willing to call out the corked wine in our own work.
Exactly. Are the metrics we're tracking actually moving the needle? Or are we holding on to a project that's no longer serving its intended purpose?
I think this is where having those clearly defined goals and metrics from the start is so helpful, because it takes the emotion out of it. We're not debating opinions, we're looking at concrete data.
100%. It's like, remember Bob from Colligan's example, the podcaster who wanted to inspire 1 million people. Well, he had tons of downloads, right? But he eventually realized most people were bailing out within the first minute or two of each episode.
Oh, no. So even though the download numbers looked good on paper,
it was a classic case of corked wine.
High downloads, but zero engagement. A recipe for disaster disguised as a success story.
Precisely. And that's why this third question is so crucial, even if it's the hardest one to ask. Is the project actually doing it? Because if it's not, we need to be willing to course correct. Maybe that means tweaking our approach. Maybe it means pivoting to a new strategy, or maybe, and this is a tough one, maybe it means scrapping the project altogether.
Knowing when to walk away is just as important as knowing when to double down, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It's like realizing you're driving down the wrong road. The longer you stay on that road, the further away from your destination you get. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is turn around and find a better route, even if it means backtracking a little.
Okay, I'm with you. So we've defined our goal, we've chosen our metrics, we've honestly assessed our progress. What's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, assuming the project IS actually doing what it's supposed to be doing, then comes the really fun part. Colligan's fourth and final question, How can you do it better?
Optimization time. I was wondering when we would get to that. Tell me everything. All right, lay it on me. How do we make things even better? What's the key to continuous improvement?
Well, the first thing is to make sure we're not jumping the gun. This question, how can you do it better? It only comes after we've honestly answered the first three. We can't improve on something if we haven't defined it, measured it, and made sure it's actually working in the first place.
So no skipping ahead. Solid foundation first, optimization second. Makes sense.
Exactly. It's like you wouldn't try to remodel your kitchen before fixing that leaky roof, right? You've got to take care of the essentials first.
Okay, love that analogy. So assuming our metaphorical roof is in good shape and our project's on the right track, how do we start making things even better?
Well, there are a million different ways to approach this, but Colligan really emphasizes flexibility and adaptability. The business world moves fast, and what worked yesterday might not work tomorrow. So we have to be willing to experiment, to try new things, and to constantly be on the lookout for ways to optimize.
It's like that quote, the only constant is change, something like that.
Exactly. And sometimes those changes, those improvements, they come from unexpected places. Remember that podcaster we talked about earlier, the one who switched from those long, highly produced episodes to the shorter, more off-the-cuff format?
Oh yeah, Linda, with the 5-minute monologues.
Yeah.
That's right. She completely changed her approach.
Right. And it totally transformed her podcast. It's a great example of how sometimes the best way to improve is to be willing to experiment, to step outside of our comfort zones and try something radically different.
It's like sometimes you got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, right?
Exactly. And that willingness to experiment, to constantly seek out ways to do things better, that's what sets apart the truly successful businesses, the ones that thrive in the long run.
So to wrap up our deep dive today, we've talked about the dangers of overactive possibility syndrome, those impulsive decisions that can lead us astray in the business world.
We've explored Colligan's 4 key questions. What do you want your project to do? How will you know the project is doing it? Is it actually doing it? And of course, how can you do it better?
4 simple questions, but as we've discovered, the answers can be surprisingly complex. And the journey to finding those answers, it's not always easy. But it's a journey worth taking, because it's the path to making more strategic decisions, achieving our goals, and ultimately building businesses that thrive. So until next time, stay curious, stay strategic, and remember, never go shopping when you're hungry.